Now for tonight's speaker, Dr. Andrew Tellis, whose topic will be the U.S.-China relationship. Dr. Tellis is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializing in international security, defense, and Asian strategic issues. He is an expert in nonproliferation, U.S. foreign and security policy, as well as regions such as South Asia, India, Pakistan, and China. As a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Dr. Tellis was involved in negotiating the civil nuclear agreement with India. And prior to joining Carnegie, he has also served as a senior advisor to the U.S. ambassador in New Delhi, on the National Security Council staff as special assistant to the president and senior director of the Strategic Planning and Southwest Asia region. As a senior policy analyst at RAND Corporation, he has also served as a senior policy analyst for the RAND Corporation and professor of policy analysis at the RAND Graduate School. In addition to numerous Carnegie and RAND reports, Dr. Tellis has edited and written and authored such publications as India's Emerging Posture, Interpreting China's Grand Strategy, Past, Present, and Future, as well as Strategic Asia 2009-2010, Economic Meltdown and Geopolitical Stability. Dr. Tellis received an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Tellis.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. I must confess, I would not have minded a shorter introduction. But I'm going to speak on the subject that I was assigned this evening, which is to look at the US-China relationship, the key issues, the determinants, and of course, our policy options. I thought the most useful way to approach this subject would be to focus on the structural issues that bedevil the US-China relationship, rather than to focus on issues of either day-to-day diplomacy or issues of process. I'll be happy to address those dimensions that I neglect in the formal presentation during the Q&A. But since this is a seminar series that looks at rethinking US strategy, I thought it would be more useful for us to spend some time reflecting on what are the underlying structural factors that impact this bilateral relationship, because these underlying structural factors are not going away. The issues of process change, the issues of day-to-day diplomacy bob and weave, but the structural factors essentially remain the bedrock on which this relationship is built. Let me start by giving you in summary form what I think is the central issue in the Sino-American relationship today. The central issue to my mind is, how does Washington manage the dilemma of sustaining economic interdependence that generates growth both in China and in the United States and the world around, while simultaneously producing potentially new geopolitical rivals to American primacy. This issue is what lies at the heart of the US-China relationship. How do we maintain the system of globalization, which serves us well, which serves China well, even though it produces in the process outcomes that may not be entirely in our interests? It is this issue that, to my mind, underlies what are all the challenges that beset us in the Sino-US relationship. And so I want to spend the time that I have before me this evening elaborating on the various dimensions of this challenge, and then with a certain degree of humility or arrogance, attempting to provide what I think may be a solution set with respect to a strategic option for the United States. I'm going to divide my presentation this evening into three broad parts. I will start by talking about the rise of China as a specific manifestation of the Asian miracle. Then I want to talk about the challenges posed by China's rise to the United States. That's the second part. And then I am going to conclude with a reflection on how one is to cope with the challenges posed by growing Chinese power. So let me start with the first item that I tabled, which is how does one look at the rise of China? I would argue that the rise of China is a very specific manifestation of what is now called the Asian miracle. I start with this premise because it is important to recognize that the Asian miracle was really created as a result of American power. But it was American power operating through a virtuous interaction with certain strategic choices made by Asian elites. And how did this process come about? In the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States did two important things that set into motion the processes that produced the Asian miracle. The first thing that the US did was that it provided security guarantees to key Asian states. These security guarantees essentially dampened the security dilemmas that trapped many of the Asian states for a long time historically, and it mitigated key external threats, the most important of which was the threat posed by the then Soviet Union. The United States did something else as well. While protecting the Asian states through its security guarantees, allowing the Asians, in a sense, to concentrate on development as opposed to security competition, the United States doubled the bet by providing a huge quantity of economic assistance in that critical phase when the Asian states were on the cusp of their own economic takeoff. And that assistance was married to asymmetric access to American markets. And it is this marriage of essentially security guarantees on one hand and asymmetric access to the American market coupled with assistance on the other that created the key American contributions to setting the Asian continent on what became a virtuous expansion of the Asian economy in the post-war period. Of course, the Asian states played a role as well. And the role that the Asian states played was that their elites made key decisions with respect to building institutions and pursuing growth strategies that were focused on maximization of output rather than internal redistribution. And so when you step back and look at the Asian miracle in retrospect, you discover that these three components essentially interacted virtuously and produced what the World Bank would call, by the late 1970s, the early 1980s, the Asian miracle. I would argue that the first wave of the miracle, and the first wave is characterized by the performance of countries like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, was clearly an unambiguous success. It was an unambiguous success because it resulted first in the demise of the chief threat to the Western community, the Soviet Union. And it was an unambiguous success because even though it resulted in the relative decline of the United States, because you had new Asian powers emerging, all these rising Asian powers ended up being America's friends. So when you look at the first wave of the Asian miracle, you get a perfect concordance between the political strategy of containment and the economic strategy of expanding interdependence. Both come together perfectly. Our enemies are essentially put out of business. And although there are other states becoming stronger as a result of this process, the states that are becoming stronger turn out to be our friends. And so when you get a situation where the stronger members of the alliance all happen to be members who pose no security threats to yourself, then this strategy cannot but be said to have an unambiguously happy ending. Now, after we complete the first wave of the Asian miracle, by the end of the Second World War, the United States pursues a second wave. And that second wave really hinges on expanding what was then an Asian free trading order into a global economic order, which is now captured by the phrase or by the term globalization. And the key decision that was made in the early 1990s was to expand this Asian economic order by essentially bringing China, which thus far had lay outside the liberal economic system, into this global regime. And this was essentially a gamble that the United States pursued in incorporating China into the WTO, and in so doing, hoping that the success that was realized in the first wave would also be expanded into the second wave of the expansion of the liberal economic system. There's one important difference, though, between the outcome of the first wave and the outcome of the second wave. In the second wave, the expansion that takes place, primarily in China and secondarily in India, now begins to create new centers of power that are not formally aligned with the United States. And therefore, you begin to ask the question about whether the second wave of expansion, which was promoted by the United States in a moment of liberal fervor in the early 1990s, has not turned out to be, in a geopolitical sense, a poisoned chalice. That is, while it certainly is expanding the growth of the global product, that is certainly something that economic interdependence does very efficiently, it has given rise to two important issues that cannot be wished away. The first is, it has made questions of relative gains central to all discussions that now take place between the United States and Asia. In other words, it is no longer important simply to ask whether all are rising as a result of economic interdependence. It is equally important to ask, and many in the United States are already asking, is how many are rising and by how much, especially relative to us. And there is a second set of issues that also comes to the table. In the process of this rise, which globalization is now producing in Asia and elsewhere, is the United States in effect producing new geopolitical competitors to itself? In other words, is the United States, as the price of expanding the global product, now nourishing the very preconditions that create new rivals and potentially new challenges to American primacy. This becomes a particularly acute issue in the case of China, because the transformation that is occurring in China, or that has been occurring since 1993, is not simply an expansion of China's economic product, but rather the creation of truly a new great power in the most comprehensive sense that we think of as great powers in the international system. Now, to be sure, the Chinese are not exactly there yet, but they have the potential capacity. They have the landmass, they have the natural resources, they have the state organization, they have the willingness and the capacity to think strategically, that if everything comes together, and it is doubtlessly still an if, but if everything comes together, in the case of China, we may be confronted with a prospect that in 1993 seemed very dim in American consciousness. The rise of a new rival that could one day challenge our primacy first in Asia and then eventually globally. So this is really what, at the end of all the disputes about process, all the disputes about minutiae, all the disputes about specifics, at the end of the day, the core question that is embedded in the US-China relationship today is the fundamental issue of what is the price for sustaining global interdependence, if that price includes the creation of new great powers who potentially could end up dethroning you from your position in the pecking order of the global system. Let me use that as a backdrop to address issues in the second part of my presentation, which is the challenges posed by China's rise to the United States. I mentioned that what is fascinating about the process of globalization and increasing interdependence is not simply the expansion of China's economic product, but rather the transformation of what was previously an underdeveloped country into a country that is now on a path to slowly, and from the Chinese perspective, hopefully surely, moving on a trajectory that would give it the great power status that it once enjoyed about 1,000 years ago when you looked at the international system around the 10th century. What globalization has essentially done for China is that it has nurtured a steady transformation from what was previously an agricultural country into an increasingly modern economy through the mechanisms of export-led growth. And because China is still at the early stages of its expansion, it has been able to exploit a phenomenon that all neoclassical economists understand as the S-shaped growth curve. That is, at the earliest stages of development, China has been able to exploit increasing returns to scale to grow faster than its peers who are more mature economies. And because China is still in the increasing returns to scale portion of the growth curve, whereas many of its peers are either in the constant returns to scale or the diminishing returns to scale phase of the growth curve, China has been able to display in the last 30 years what can only be described as volcanic growth rates. And volcanic growth rates actually, even by historical standards, that is, even if you look at the rise of the European economies from about 1600 onwards, we have not seen sustained growth of double-digit levels for as long in the case of Europe as we have seen in the case of China. Now, this rapid growth has been a product in part for technical reasons, because when you are at the earliest stage of growth and can exploit increasing returns to scale, you are going to grow faster than others. But there is also a peculiarity in Chinese political economy that has pushed China into such massive expansion. The competition between the center in China and the provinces has resulted in a massive expansion of productive capacity, where in the struggle for power, the center and the provinces constantly seek to maximize their gains by producing larger and larger sets of industrial enterprises. The Chinese expansion of the last 30 years has not been the pure market expansion that has often been advertised, because the state controls not simply commodities, but also factors of production. And because there is constant rivalry between provinces and the localities, provinces and the center, the one consequence of that constant rivalry has been a continuing expansion of productive capacity, because it is driven by the desire to maximize the returns to individual agents. Now, because this expansion has often not occurred in a market environment, it has been comprehensively wasteful expansion. If you look at the inputs that China uses to produce any given unit of output, China uses almost 10 times the units of output, the inputs that are used in the West, and over 3 times the units used in a peer like India for any given unit of output. Now, this process, if it continues, can lead to one of 2 outcomes. One outcome is a slowdown in growth and possibly an implosion. And this outcome could arise because at some point there is still a disjuncture between China's command politics and its quasi-market economics. It could also arise because there are limits to what the old communists used to call extensive growth strategies. That is, if your growth arises simply because you are shoveling larger and larger quantities of inputs, there will come a time when you are simply going to run out of inputs. And when you run out of inputs, or when you run out of inputs at a time when your growth begins to hit the constant returns to scale or the diminishing returns to scale, then you are inevitably going to end up in a slowdown and possibly an economic implosion. There is, however, an alternative possibility. And that alternative possibility is that the Chinese state will recognize that the extensive growth strategy it has pursued since 1978 cannot be sustained. And because it cannot be sustained ad infinitum, it slowly begins to manage its production processes more effectively. That is, it slowly starts transforming its political system into something that is more responsive to popular need. And it slowly starts increasing the size of its markets, not simply with respect to commodities, but also with respect to factors of production. That is, it slowly starts creating genuine markets where the prices of things reflect their actual scarcity. And if China evolves in this direction, you could get an outcome where what started off as an extensive growth strategy slowly mutates into an intensive growth strategy, and that intensive growth strategy becomes very responsive to the economic demands of efficiency. And because it is responsive to the economic demands of efficiency, you get progressively greater success. Now let us think about the geopolitics of this. You get a very interesting paradox. Slowdown and implosion obviously has social consequences in China that are deleterious. Because if you have a slowdown and an implosion in China, many millions of people would be denied the opportunity to have a better life. But it could potentially be very good geopolitically from the perspective of others who are threatened by the rise of Chinese power. On the other hand, if you think of adjustment and success would be very good for Chinese domestically, because it essentially means that the economy has become more efficient. It means that there are less difficulties and fractures within the system. But it means that it becomes potentially problematic for those of China's competitors. And so you get this paradoxical outcome where slowdown and implosion creates socially beneficial consequences within China, socially bad consequences within China, but geopolitically favorable consequences outside. And you get adjustment and success creating favorable consequences within China, but bad consequences on the outside. What is China's own strategy as it works its way through this adjustment? China's strategy has been captured by the phrase that has been much debated in China. It's called peaceful rise. Well, the actual phrase, peaceful rise, has actually been discredited because there was a very peculiar debate within the Chinese Communist Party about whether they could actually accept the notion of peaceful rise. And they finally decided that they could not accept the notion of peaceful rise because to admit that they could peacefully rise would suggest that there is an alternative possibility of a non-peaceful rise. And since the idea of a non-peaceful rise was simply unacceptable, even as a theoretical possibility because it would make a lot of Asians nervous, the central plenum of the Chinese Communist Party basically said, you are hereby forbidden to use the term peaceful rise. And it was replaced by the alternative term called peaceful development. I don't like the term peaceful development because it actually fails to capture what I think is really what is most interesting about the rise of China as a great power, and that is its rise. So I'm going to use the word peaceful rise, even though this would be repudiated, certainly by the Chinese leadership. I think China, as it works its way through this transition, is attempting to pursue the strategy of peaceful rise, and it has, to my mind, 5 key components. The first component is the need to sustain high levels of economic growth through conscious state management of the economy in order to protect the internal social contract. Now, what is the internal social contract? The internal social contract essentially means the Chinese people continue to give up personal freedoms and the right to choose their own regime, so long as those political losses are compensated by increasing personal incomes and sustained economic growth. It's another way of essentially keeping what is a non-representative regime in power. And because the Chinese Communist Party obviously wants to be in power for a longer time as opposed to a shorter time, logic dictates that the only way it can sustain that lock on power is by essentially implementing the social contract. And so the social contract is sustain high levels of economic growth for as long as possible. Because if you can sustain that growth, that's what ensures Chinese acquiescence to the current political arrangements. There's a second component of peaceful rise, which is as China begins to grow, deepen regional economic integration, that is, tie China ever more tightly to the countries on its periphery, while continuing to sustain effective demand in the United States for American goods. Both these elements of the second component are critical. Deepening regional integration essentially creates ties of dependence on China. It creates incentives for the regional states, especially those in China's periphery, not to challenge China because their own well-being is tied intimately to the regional economic regime that evolves as a result of the gigantic Chinese motor, which is its economy. In a political sense, what deepened economic integration regionally does is that it incites China's neighbors to bandwagon with China rather than balance against it. And the second component is just as important. You want to maintain sustained American demand for Chinese goods because in effect what it does is it creates a mutual hostage relationship between Beijing and Washington, whereby Beijing becomes the supplier of capital and Washington becomes the supplier of effective demand. And that has, in a sense, been the nature of the peculiar symbiosis in US-China relations economically for the last 2 decades. The Chinese buy our T-bills, and we repay the complement through our overconsumption. It serves both perfectly. We continue to produce, we continue to buy Chinese goods. The Chinese take the revenues from those purchases, recycle them by buying our T-bills, which essentially provides us the capital that then allows us to continue the system going. Third component of peaceful rise: preserve external peace to the maximum degree possible, but without compromising on your territorial and your status claims, while continually looking for every opportunity to defeat any incipient efforts at balancing. Peace on China's periphery is important to China. China cannot afford to sustain this transition, which, as I said, is still in the early stages, until it actually reaches the point where it becomes a mature great power, if in the process it is distracted by rivalries and wars involving its neighbors. And so the one thing that the Chinese have learned from the Asian miracle was that the Asian states essentially became productive because they were peaceful. And in the case of the Asian states, that peace was essentially enforced by the United States. In the second iteration of the Asian miracle, the United States may or may not be able to provide that peace. But to the degree that China can, it certainly ought to. And so China has paid special emphasis on adopting as pacific policies as possible. But the caveats are equally important. The pursuit of pacific policies has not come at the price of surrendering territorial and status claims, and it has not come as a result of acquiescing to any incipient balancing activities on the part of the Asian states. Fourth component: China has been engaged in a slow but steady build-up of military capabilities. And these military capabilities are focused primarily on defending the homeland, by which I mean the Chinese definition of what constitutes the homeland, and that includes Taiwan. It is focused on enabling Beijing to defend the territorial claims that it may have vis-à-vis regional states like Japan, like India. And increasingly, it is oriented to underwriting China's capacity to protect its global interests. And these global interests primarily have to do today with respect to energy. Fifth and finally, the last element of peaceful rise has been the deliberate Chinese decision to continue free riding with respect to the global provision of public goods. So when it comes, for example, to freedom of navigation, the freedom to trade, all the things that we take for granted and which make globalization possible, the Chinese have preferred that somebody else bear the cost for maintaining this liberal regime. And they've been lucky that there has been, in fact, a great power willing to maintain these costs, and that happens to be the United States. And because global public goods, by definition, are goods that are essentially non-rival in consumption and non-excludable, as long as they're produced, you can continue to enjoy them even if you don't pay for them. And so for as long as the eye can see, it is likely that China will continue to free ride to the maximum degree possible. This is not because the Chinese are malicious. It's simply because they are rational. And given where they are at their level of development, it is eminently rational for them to enjoy the benefits of what the United States provides the international community without having to pay for it. Now, this strategy of peaceful rise has served them well, but it has posed three distinct kinds of challenges to the United States. The first basket of challenges are fundamentally economic challenges. And those economic challenges come in different dimensions. Let me just flag some of them. It has resulted in significant and ongoing deindustrialization in the United States. This is what people mean when they complain about offshoring, that American manufacturing, where once upon a time the United States was the world's workshop for everything from automobiles to plastic toys, now happen to be all built somewhere else, mostly in China. And it has resulted essentially in capital, in technology, moving elsewhere. So one important element of this economic challenge has been the shifts in the product cycle, where things that previously were manufactured in country, because the United States had a comparative advantage in manufacturing them in country, progressively are now manufactured elsewhere. It's also led to other kinds of challenges. American dependence on capital. As I pointed out earlier, we have ended up in a very peculiar situation with a very peculiar model of capital formation, where our capital is essentially produced by the surpluses of our trading partners, who then lend us those surpluses in order that we may consume the goods that our trading partners then ship to us. Now, this is a wonderful game. I mean, this is a game that can actually, in theory, go on forever until someone changes their mind. And then, of course, when someone changes their mind, you better make sure that you're not left in the wrong corner of the room when the music stops. But as long as everyone is willing to play this game, this is the game that can go on. But I want to flag the point that this is an economic challenge because no one knows when the game stops. There is increasing competition now in innovation and adjustment. Now, thankfully for us, the United States is still the world leader in terms of innovation. So if you look, for example, at patent statistics, if you look, for example, at venture capital, if you look at where innovation is taking place in the most macroscopic form, it's still the United States. But innovation is not cost-free. It's always disruptive. And because innovation is disruptive, there are adjustment costs. And those adjustment costs have to be paid. And therefore, even though in theory one can make the argument, oh, the fact that America is deindustrializing means that American labor can now be put to more productive, higher value end enterprises, is easier said than done. Because in practice, when it actually means taking a man from the shop floor who's trained all his life to do a particular job and suddenly telling him, oops, they now do it better and cheaper in China, you should now get into the software business and move to Silicon Valley, that's kind of hard to stomach. So there's a whole basket of economic challenges. The second basket. The second basket is geopolitical challenges. And the geopolitical challenges essentially come in the form of the regional economic integration that I described to you, that is now occurring in Asia, with China as the hub, and all the peripheral Asian states on China's periphery being tied to China because the division that is taking place in the production chains. That regional economic integration could potentially give rise to a new Chinese sphere of influence and potentially a new Chinese sphere of dominance. So, if at some point what starts off as regional economic integration progressively mutates into a sphere of influence with China at the core, we could end up potentially in an awkward position where our access to Asia, not in a physical sense, but in a comprehensive sense, begins to become weaker and weaker. And Asia, which is the strategic prize, becomes an asset that progressively lies outside of American reach. There's a third challenge, and the third challenge is the military challenge. And the military challenge, again, arises from the first two challenges, that you begin to have a China that is growing more powerful, more wealthy, more capable, wanting for very logical, self-interested reasons, wanting to protect its periphery. And because it wants to protect its periphery, evolving and developing military capabilities that are fundamentally intended to prevent the United States from being able to intervene in any disputes that China may either have with countries that it considers to be part of its own homeland, or other countries that may lie adjacent to it. And so you have a military modernization that is focused on anti-access and area denial, that takes increasingly a form of challenging what was traditionally the US command of the commons, and because of developments in particularly the area of strategic nuclear weapons, could potentially pose increased threats to the US homeland itself. And so what you have on balance is the interaction of these three challenges that are slowly evolving. Now remember, the point to keep in mind is that these challenges have not materialized because the Chinese are nasty people. These challenges have not materialized because the Politburo has a secret manual for world conquest, and that they're going chapter by chapter according to the plan. These challenges have materialized simply because it is a natural evolution of China's own growing capabilities. But the fact that it is a natural evolution still has serious geopolitical consequences for others. And the fact that it is natural in the sense of inevitable does not make the challenge posed, particularly to the United States, which enjoys a certain primacy in the current geopolitical system, any the less urgent or any the more easy. Let me briefly talk about the last part of the presentation, where I told you I would talk about how does one cope with these challenges. Before one starts talking about coping with the challenges, one has to admit that the challenges themselves will depend on what you believe China's future to be. That is, if you believe China's future inevitably involves slowdown and implosion, then you get a very different set of challenges than if you believe that China's future involves adjustment and success. If it is slowdown and implosion, then you're really talking of primarily humanitarian challenges. That is decayed economic growth, maybe greater civil unrest in China, and that imposes us with the burdens of trying to figure out how to help the Chinese state, in a sense, keep itself together in what may be trying circumstances. If, on the other hand, you have a future which is defined essentially by progressive Chinese adjustment and success, then you're faced with the big issue of geopolitical risk. Because that entails the question of what does China's success mean ultimately for the United States. Now, I'm going to focus on the latter, because to my mind, if you have a Chinese slowdown or a Chinese implosion, it's not that it's not going to be serious, but the kinds of challenges that that scenario poses are challenges that we can deal with the tools that we currently have in our capacity. But on the other hand, if the alternate future is the future that comes to pass, that is adjustment and success, then you are faced with a brave new world. And I want to identify for you 3 alternative worlds that really are out there if China's success continues inexorably over time. And let me talk about the future of globalization itself, because that is really a very important issue that we have not really begun to grapple with. If you begin to see sustained Chinese success, the first future that we have to think about is that globalization might atrophy, that it might decay, that it might come apart. And that future is a possibility because as China grows in power, the United States, which is the reigning hegemon, chooses to reduce its contribution with respect to producing global public goods. It's happened before. It happened in the case of Great Britain, where at some point you begin to say, oops, this globalization is not exactly what I had planned for, because it's producing states that are growing stronger and more capable than I am. So why should I continue to subsidize and underwrite the growth of others? I will progressively retrench my own contributions. And if that were to happen, the globalization that we all take for granted today as a permanent reality is going to decay. For those of you who don't believe me, look at what happened to globalization after the First World War, when essentially the reigning hegemon of that era, Great Britain, essentially was weakened as a result of the Great War and simply could not sustain its economic and its political obligations. There's a second future to globalization. It doesn't atrophy, it's actually rescued. And it's rescued because every American retrenchment is compensated for by increasing Chinese contributions to the production of global public goods. Aha, but this rescue comes with a catch. The catch is that the current US-centric global system slowly mutates into what will then be a Sino-centric global system. And there's a third future to globalization. And that globalization is that it neither atrophies in one go, nor is it rescued in one go, but it rather is continually contested. It's contested, it becomes like a sine wave, where the US sustains its contributions as long as it thinks it's getting the better part of the deal. When it stops getting the better part of the deal, it withdraws the rate at which it contributes, at which point the Chinese, trying to keep the system together, increase their contributions, so then you get an upswing. And then when the Chinese begin to do the math and say, hey, we've just increased our contributions, but we're not getting as much as the US, which has just declined its contributions, then begins to retrench its own contributions. And then you get a sine wave effect. Now, these are all models that come out from the fertile minds of neoclassical economists. The real world is a bad approximation of these waves, but you can't entirely rule it out. It has happened before. The net result of this kind of a world is that globalization degenerates essentially into regional trading blocs. Where you basically say, look, I'm not interested in providing public goods on a global scale. I'm going to provide public goods only in that neck of the woods where I have real interests. And for China, that would be Asia. And so then you move towards creating an Asian economic system where China gets the greatest rewards in exchange for the greatest contributions. Now, if this were to happen, remember, this is going to happen in the context of rising Chinese power. Now, there's one good thing about rising Chinese power from the perspective of the United States. And the good thing about rising Chinese power is that there are many more countries that are closer to China than we are. And that means that if the future that I posited for you is the future that comes about, that is adjustment and success, there will be other countries that will have to cope with that reality a microsecond, or at least a microsecond before we do. And I can think of at least 3 countries that come to mind: Japan, India, and Russia. Now, the good thing about these 3 countries is that they are not exactly pushovers. Each of these countries has great histories, large landmass, great potential national power, and they have the capacity to do internal balancing, that is, get their own resources, get their own act together. And even more interestingly, they have the capacity to do external balancing. And you know what? External balancing is already underway. The Indians and the Japanese are beginning to talk in hushed tones about how they need to cooperate vis-a-vis that certain unmentioned and unmentionable neighbor that lies between them. The Russians, who have never seen a ruble they didn't like, even the Russians, have begun to now become conscious about the technologies they transfer to China. Because you know what? Su-27s have this funny habit of mutating into F-10s. And as they always used to say, scratch a Russian and find a Tatar. The Russians begin to think that, gee, all these exports going down south, my God, one day they might just come back north. So you're beginning to see already on the periphery of the Asian continent increasing willingness to respond to growing Chinese capabilities. What does this mean for us? What it means for us in the near term is that the United States is not going to have the luxury of pursuing pure strategies towards China. Now, this goes back to the very first point I started this presentation with. In the Cold War, we had the luxury of pure strategies. We could basically say, we are going to contain the Soviet Union. It was easy to do. Well, it wasn't really easy to do, but it was easier to do because we were not involved with the Soviet Union in any economic sense. They lived in their universe, we lived in ours. In fact, both sides went to great lengths to avoid becoming overly dependent on the other. And so whatever the challenges of managing the competition were, they were a lot easier because you lived on different planets. That's not going to be true for our management of relations with China. So all US strategy towards China will be mixed strategies, which means they're going to be strategies that are going to confuse a hell of a lot of people. They're going to be strategies that are going to make a lot of people mad because you're never going to get intellectual and moral clarity. And they're going to be strategies that are going to be very difficult to implement in practice. Because for those of you who work in the US government and who know what a beast that is, implementing simple strategies is hard enough. Implementing complex strategies that call for nuance, that call for balance, my God, what kind of an animal is that? This is going to be the challenge that we are going to be faced with as we move forward. But let me tell you something. For those of us who expect that as we work these mixed strategies, the Chinese are going to be responsible stakeholders. That was the phrase used in the previous administration. I believe it was the term of art that Bob Zoellick popularized. For those who believe that the Chinese are going to be responsible stakeholders, think again. If you are the rising power, you do not become a responsible stakeholder in somebody else's system. You become a responsible stakeholder only when you can recast the system in your own image and likeness. When the system begins to serve your interests, that's when you become a responsible stakeholder. So, for the foreseeable future, until the point where China becomes a genuine great power, the fundamental objective of the Chinese state is going to be accumulating capacity without raising alarm. The objective is going to be power maximization, power accumulation, while at the same time preempting balancing. Now, in the face of this reality, we have only difficult choices. There are three choices in principle that you have, or at least these are the choices that have been around since time immemorial. The first is the one that Machiavelli loved, which is preventive war. You see the rising power, you go out there, you strangle them while they're still in the crib. In fact, if you go and read Machiavelli's discourses on the 10 books of Titus Livy, he's got these passages where he speaks adoringly about the Romans and how they fixed the Greeks, even when the Greeks were really no challenge to the Romans, but because the Romans were so far-sighted and saw the rise of the Greeks as potentially threatening them, they went out there and cleaned their clocks. So first strategy, preventive war. Second strategy is comprehensive containment. It's the Kennan strategy of the Cold War. You can't really go out and do preventive war, so you do comprehensive containment. Internal balancing and external balancing married to managed autarky. There's a third approach. The third approach is you say, you know, these crazy realists, they've got it all wrong. Between preventive war and containment, it's like the devil in the deep blue sea. What you really need to do is try a healthy dose of liberalism. And liberalism essentially means you promote interdependence and you export democracy. I mean, there are two liberal schools. And so if you buy this solution, then you basically try and make China a democracy, in which case it becomes less of a threat. Or you say, far from reducing interdependence, we actually deepen it. Because if we deepen the interdependence, then we end up putting both sides into a mutual hostage relationship, and that mutual hostage relationship prevents them from breaking out. I'll put my prejudices on the table right away. I ain't a liberal. So, I'm not going to argue that the United States should be betting the farm either on the rise of Chinese democracy or on the hopes that economic interdependence will help us all get along. On the other hand, my other two favorite realist prescriptions are not particularly palatable prescriptions either. anyone who's thinking seriously about preventive war with China ought to have his head examined. Anyone who thinks you can do comprehensive containment a la Kennan today also ought to have his head examined. Because this is not the regime that we consciously set out to build. So what do we have? My argument is you've got to have a mixed strategy that ultimately has two broad components. The first component is you do not walk back from interdependence, but you strengthen it and shape it. And you strengthen it and shape it in specific ways, which I will talk about in a few minutes. But you continue to focus on interdependence, and you continue to build the liberal economic order. And you do that because even though economic growth empowers our rivals, it also happens to be good for us. And there's a second component. Even as you do the economic interdependence, you don't forget about power. Because if you forget about power, you will dissolve the glue that actually makes interdependence work. States do not become interdependent unless they know that there is someone out there willing to enforce the rules. And you cannot enforce the rules unless you carry the biggest possible stick. So if you want to make a mixed strategy work, your success with sustaining interdependence is going to come at the cost of really sustaining your own capacities. And so when I think of a mixed strategy, I think of a strategy that basically is going to have a few components. What are these components? The first is I want to expand the trading regime globally. I want to have cross-cutting linkages among as many countries as I can, because the more the linkages, the greater the efficiency with which I build up my own economic growth. I particularly want to deepen the interdependence I have with my friends, because that growth is non-threatening, and that's the growth that I want to encourage. Second, I want to deepen engagement with China. It's very important for us to do that. We don't want to make China an enemy before its time, even if it is destined to become one eventually. So we want to stay engaged with China. But even as we stay engaged with China, we want to go out and build strategic partnerships with all the key countries on China's periphery. Why? Because what I want to do is create objective structures of constraint that will prevent Beijing from misusing its power when it finally gets it. And the best way to create those objective structures of constraint is for me to have privileged relationships with all the key countries in China's periphery, even as I deepen my relationships with Beijing itself. Third, I want to start looking inwards. And I want to think about renewing and strengthening the sinews of American power. This strategy cannot succeed if you continue to have a hollowing out of American power at home. And so it requires us to focus honestly on the challenges that we have to meet inside. Economic renewal, looking at our very problematic model of capital formation, looking at the things that we need to do to sustain our lead with respect to innovation. As long as we can maintain the United States as the world's most dynamic economy, we have nothing to fear. Because at the end of the day, power flows from your capacity to innovate. And if you can innovate faster than the other guy, you will stay on top. And this, of course, means looking at our science and technology capacities. It means looking at our education, particularly our tertiary education, which is absolutely world class. We don't want to end up in a situation like we now have at the University of California in Berkeley, where tenured professors have to go out to take their garbage. Because even though they may be great garbage men, the theory of comparative advantage tells us that physicists their time is better spent figuring about unified theories as opposed to hauling garbage. Right? These are things that we need to do. So there's a lot of stuff that we have to do at home. At the end of the day, we have to also look at American military power. That kind of looks odd because American military power is the most powerful when you look at it in comparative terms. Yes, that's true, but there are also crucial weaknesses. We cannot sustain military budgets at the levels that we have today without something giving way. We have to be smarter in the way we think about procurement. We have to be smarter in the way that we think about jointness. We have to be smarter in the way we develop new weapons. You can't have weapon systems that are acquired with a certain price tag only to be finally purchased with a price tag that is 3 times the original estimate. All of you know these issues better than I do. But there is a fundamental task of renewal that has to take place at home. Most important thing, though, I have to say this particularly when I speak to my friends in the administration. All 3 components of the strategy have to go together. You can't pick and choose. You can't say, oh, this year we're going to do engagement with China. We don't have the energy and the time to do anything else. It doesn't work. Nor can you say, this year we're going to do engagement with China's neighbors. Or this year we're going to only look at renewal within the United States. We don't have the time to do anything else. It doesn't work. The success of this strategy derives from holding things in balance. If you don't hold things in balance, you end up essentially unsettling the strategy. Because if you focus on engagement with China to the neglect of everything else, you rattle China's neighbors. If you focus simply on internal renewal without external engagement, people think you've checked out. If you focus simply on strengthening ties with China's neighbors and not engage China, it looks like de facto containment. So you've got to do all these things simultaneously. If you do these things simultaneously, you stand a chance of sustaining your capacities until things become a little more clear than they are today. And that's what we have to look for. We have to look forward to the point where there will be a little more strategic clarity than we have today. And this strategy, wretched as it is, complicated as it is, I would hazard is probably the best, at least my little pea-side brain could come up with. On that note, I will end, and if I have a few minutes, I will take a few questions.
Yes, most certainly we'd like to open up to some questions because Dr. Tellis has provided us some very provocative issues here for thought. However, I'd like to make 2 observations, please. As usual, when you ask a question, please state your name and your organization for the record. And number 2, given the time constraints that we have, please keep your questions 2 questions and make your questions short. Please. Okay. So we will open it up now for questions.
I'll try to do the same with the answers as well.
Sir, Major Jason Torgerson. I'm from Air Force Strategy Office. I had a question come up. We were evaluating some of China's history with industrialization and global industrialization, how historically it's happened. How are the environmental concerns as China continues to develop? We're starting to see some signs and symptoms of basically not paying attention to environmental concerns. How big of a factor is that into their continued growth?
I think it's a very significant factor. In fact, that is what I was maybe a tad too subtly trying to allude when I spoke about the extensive growth strategy. The extensive growth strategy that China's pursued is essentially throwing every resource it can to producing a given unit of output without taking into account the cost of those resources. I'll give you a very simple example. The water table in China today is dropping by meters every year. There will come a point where they will simply run out of potable water. Now, you have one of 2 choices at that point. You either come up with technologically innovative solutions like desalinating seawater, something like that. Or you begin to look at your neighbors and start diverting their water. The Chinese have to give thought to both. They've certainly given thought to the second, and that's leaving a lot of people nervous and uncomfortable. But the bottom line is, the Chinese simply cannot use resources in the way that they have in the past. And the question then becomes, do they realize the problem early enough and change course? Or do they find what can only be crudely considered workarounds? And these workarounds can be very costly in economic and in political terms. Now, the problem with doing the first, which is changing course, is that it's extremely hard to do. And it's particularly hard to do when you do not have market mechanisms. See, the great things about markets is that they have these funny things called prices. And when you start misusing commodities, prices go up. And that's a signal for you to economize on the misuse. But if you really don't have prices that alert you to the misuse of resources, then you have to find other ways to figure out what you're doing less efficiently and what you're doing more efficiently. And unfortunately, there is no good market system yet in China. And to move to a market system essentially then requires you to change the character of the Chinese state. And I'm not sure the Chinese Communist Party has bought into that solution just yet. So it's going to be far more difficult than even I know it'll be.
Thank you. Mark Ribbing with the Department of the Navy. Can you talk a little bit about Taiwan? What do you see in the near to medium term with regard to that issue between China and the United States?
You know, there was a point about 10 years ago, prior to 1995-96, where the Chinese felt comfortable with the status quo. That is, as long as the Taiwanese did not move in the direction of independence, they felt comfortable that they could live with that reality of a separated island, but that in theory still remains part of the Chinese nation. Unfortunately for us, they appear to be moving away from that position. And they're moving away from that position for understandable reasons. As time passes, the number of native-born Taiwanese begin to outnumber those who came from the mainland. In other words, that proportion of the population that thinks of itself as an independent Taiwanese nation because they know no better begins to increase in size relative to those who fled. If you allow this process to continue, you end up at some point in the future with a Taiwanese population that says, what ties to China? We are an independent nation. We've always been an independent nation. I was born here. I grew up here. I lived here all my life. So the Chinese are beginning to recognize that the position that they had pre-1995 doesn't solve their strategic problem. And their strategic problem is that they wanted to be unified. They wanted to be part of the Chinese state. And they're willing to think of a whole range of arrangements. You know, one country, two systems, one country, three systems, what have you. But they're beginning to recognize now that simply permitting the status quo to persist might in effect be de facto independence, even if it's not de jure independence. And if you are in the CCP, de facto independence is just as bad. And so what I fear, it's not clear, it's not entirely clear, but what I fear is that the status quo ends up with a denouement that is not comforting. That sooner or later, there is some Chinese leader who says, can't take the risk. You just can't allow this to persist. And then, of course, decides to do something. Now, I don't know what that something is. One can speculate about what that might be. But if you ask me for the next 3 to 5 years, no. They won't do anything dramatic. But as one looks outside of a 5-year or a 10-year period, when one looks at the demographic shifts and one begins to find that those who fled the mainland are really passing from the scene, then can the Chinese afford to, in a sense, wait? I think that becomes the issue. And so it's not surprising to me that if you are a Chinese decision maker thinking about this kind of a future, that two consequences immediately fall out of this analysis. One, sooner or later you will have to act, which means you need to have the military resources to implement whatever you choose to do. And two, you've got to deal with those ghastly Americans who you never know what they might do. They might actually come to the rescue. And if they do decide to come to the rescue, then you've got to do whatever is necessary to prevent that from happening. And so the second consequence then becomes the anti-access area denial strategy investments just continue to be sustained. Now, of course, there is an unintended consequence of all of this, that all the investments made for anti-access and area denial are ultimately omnidirectional investments. Right? You may start off with Taiwan, but let's assume down the line Taiwan gets resolved. Amphibious warfare capabilities can be used anywhere. Ballistic missiles can be used anywhere. Developing long-range combat aviation can be used anywhere. I mean, there are all kinds of things.
Good evening, Steve Holder from ODNI. China's always been big on Aretha Franklin's respect and don't interfere in my internal affairs. And it's become very obvious over the last 10 or 15 years, even since they've come into the WTO, that they've been very reluctant to implement a lot of agreements they've agreed to implement.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, I like your strategies and engagement with China, but if you keep on giving in to the Chinese and don't treat them like another international member of the world, they'll just keep on rolling over you.
I couldn't agree with you more. And when I talk of engaging the Chinese, I don't mean we have to now proceed to become doormats. For me, engagement is keeping your lines of communication open, having a civil state-to-state relationship, even when you have fundamental disagreements. And when you have disagreements on things that matter to you, then by God, defend your interests. Because if you don't defend your interests, it's not just the Chinese, it's everybody else. They will walk over you. And why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they? If you can't defend your own interests, fool be you. The fact is, we are going to see greater Chinese assertiveness over time. To me, a good insight into what the future holds is Chinese behavior since the economic crisis and Chinese behavior prior to the economic crisis. It's very clear after the economic crisis that the Chinese have come out of the crisis better than most. I don't think it's a permanent solution, because if I had the time, I would tell you about the way the Chinese solved their economic crisis, which is actually a time bomb that's ticking. But leave that aside. For the moment, they think they've come out better than most. There has been a very sharp shift in the quality of their diplomacy. It has become much tougher. It has become much more, I don't want to say strident, but certainly much more confident. And they have not had compunctions about telling us off. The way they handled the president when he went to Beijing, I think, was a wonderful exhibit in what rising powers do when they think they know the slope of the growth curves. If you think your slope is upwards and the other guy's slope is downwards, there are limits to which you want to be Mr. Nice Guy. And so yes, absolutely. Engaging them is no substitute for protecting your own interests.
Thank you. Colonel Greg Schultz, Army Staff. Somewhat related to the previous question, it strikes me one element that's missing from your strategy, or maybe it's assumed within that, is smartly adapting and reinforcing the international systems and forums that have really benefited the U.S. and most of our allies for 50 years, and then try to smartly adapt them so they incorporate India's interests and those of the countries around China. Your thoughts on how we might be able to do that?
I thank you for raising that. I should have actually formally put that in as a component of the strategy because I think there's a value to putting it formally. Well, in my crude way of thinking about the world, let me be honest again. I have a somewhat dim view of international institutions, but they have their users. And because they have their users, we should use them. When I think of having privileged relations with countries in China's periphery, I think part of those privileged relationships would be bringing them on board in certain international institutions where they can serve as a very useful foil for buffeting Chinese aims vis-a-vis our own. But you're right, there is a case to be made for highlighting the adjustment and adaptation of international institutions to better reflect that as a standalone element in the strategy. I agree with you completely. I think we have to do it. And there are simple ways to start. We don't have to rush off to reform the United Nations Security Council, though at some point there's a strong case for throwing a few of those characters actually off. I won't name those because I don't think I'll be welcome in some truly beautiful countries that I love. But a simple example, the International Energy Agency. The International Energy Agency is supposed to be the clearinghouse for managing demand and supply of energy resources. And the two biggest consumers of energy in the world are not members. Something wrong there. You need to think about it. You think about the NPT. We have now emerging nuclear powers that are outside the NPT system. Can't keep them forever. You've got to think about that in creative means. It's going to be hard. I mean, all these decisions are going to be very painful and people are going to get mad and you're never going to be able to satisfy everyone, but you've got to do it. I agree with you.
Major Bob Johnson, Army G8. What is your take on the Google issue?
To be honest, I don't know what to make of it. I mean, I understand it at a superficial level, which is Google has finally gotten religion. They might have figured out that they were not making too much money anyway, so nothing like a grand, little grand model standing there. But I don't know what to make of it, in the sense that for every Google that decides to take its money and its business away, there are many others who are still willing to stay. And as long as that is the case, the Chinese state will always have options. They will play one against the other. And if I was in their position, I would do exactly the same. So the question becomes, this is, I think, the more interesting question for which I don't have an answer. Is Google the leading edge of a wave of exits for whatever reason? If it were, something could be afoot. If it is not, I'm sure it would satisfy Google's managers and its owners or whatever that they've done the right thing at last. But I think the Chinese will just shrug this off and get on to the next thing. Let me say one thing which I don't want to forget. What Google has managed to show is that capitalism has a very interesting logic. It's called the logic of profits. Right? And because that's what matters to stakeholders in any modern business, you are willing to do whatever is necessary as long as your primary objectives of creating profits are sustained. And as long as the Chinese state know that that's what makes the system tick, for every Google that exits, there are probably a score more institutions and entities that are willing to stay in the game, because no matter what their moral reservations about doing business in China may be, at the end, if it contributes to the bottom line, so be it. What I find interesting about the way China manages information technology is that it has managed to actually get Western companies to do the dirty work for it. The Chinese state does not censor per se. I mean, this is really a misconception. People think that it does. It doesn't. What it does is it compels ISPs to do the censoring. And what the Chinese state goes after is only that small subset that the ISPs either cannot or will not touch, either because the character set is of strategic importance. But the bulk of the vanilla filtering that is done in China is done by Western companies who have accepted that as the price of staying involved in that market. And if that's the deal you get being in Beijing, that's a wonderful deal to have. Yes, ma'am.
Kathleen Robertson, Athena Strategies. You mentioned at the outset of your talk about China and its pursuit of energy globally, and you didn't really come back to that. And in this demand outpacing supply environment that we live in, how threatening do you see that China has negotiated lots of agreements with countries all over the world to maintain its own energy supplies?
I think it is, well, first I think it's a bad strategy. But that may be simply because I've read too much of neoclassical economics, and the communists in Beijing probably haven't. My view ultimately is that what serves the Chinese best is an efficient and fully functioning market. If you believe that, then you don't need to go out and engage in the behaviors that they have over the last 20 years. You don't need to buy equity oil stakes. You don't need to go into actually buying real estate where these resources are located. I mean, you may do that as a business proposition. I have no problems with anyone doing that as a business proposition. But you don't do that as an economic security strategy. Your security comes from having a market where demand and supply is matched through prices. I don't see the Chinese as being there just yet. I think they're moving in that direction. Now, it's very important to us that they do. If they don't, you end up with a set of strategic consequences that I would prefer not to see. See, the great thing about relying on the international market is that if there is market failure, prices shoot up. And if prices shoot up, you end up economizing on consumption. And that's how you re-equilibrate. If you end up doing what the Chinese do, and there is market failure, that is the investments or the purchases you've made don't yield returns, there's only one way to solve the problem, and that is through military force. You've got to go out there and basically read the riot act to those who have defaulted on the deal. And before you know it, it's going to take the Chinese state in the direction of protecting sea lines of communication, putting forces abroad, making strange deals with odious regimes. I mean, they're already doing some of that. But if you move in the mercantilist direction of managing energy, or for that matter, any natural resource, not just energy, then the tail end of mercantilism is always military expansions. I mean, there's a reason why the European empires were built. They were built essentially on mercantilist foundations. And so my fear about Chinese strategy is not the strategy per se, but where the strategy takes them. And if it takes them in that direction, because if they are rational, they will go there, then that has real serious consequences for my interests. And so I'd prefer not to have them go there. And so I think maybe one contribution we can make is to send a bunch of MIT economists to Beijing and give them the treatment. Micro and macro 101. Yes, sir.
Charles Feldmayer, NAMO. One of the things you didn't mention in Peaceful Rise is your view of North Korea, and how does that fit into the overall Chinese strategy? I wonder if you could comment on that.
I'll do that briefly because I think North Korea is a bit of an embarrassment to them today. It didn't start out that way. I mean, I think it started out with the expectation that North Korea was a useful card to have. It prevented the United States from really entrenching itself on the Asian continent. It kept one of America's allies hopping, South Korea. But the Chinese market logic has since taken over. And they've begun to realize between investing in the hermit kingdom, where the rates of return are close to zero, if not negative, and investing in South Korea, you come out ahead investing in South Korea. And so I think Chinese strategy today towards North Korea is keep them alive, because you don't want them to implode. Because if they implode, you have a refugee problem and you have instability in the north. And God forbid we ever return to the 1950s, where the Americans and the South Koreans start moving northwards, coming right up to the Yalu, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So at the moment, I see Chinese attitudes to North Korea as being one of, how do we keep these characters in place, because they do serve a purpose by their existence, but how do we prevent them from getting too big for their britches, such that they end up causing problems that we would prefer not to be involved in. So it's a more conservative strategy today than I would say it was 20 years ago. Yes? Hang on for a second.
Ashok Sivakumar with JHUAPL and Joint Reserve Unit under DDR&E. A question about commodities and risk. Statistics show that China has geographic and economic dominance over certain rare earth metals, mining, very important pipeline processes that affect certain elements necessary not only for commercial but essential military applications and technologies that we use. Can you comment a little bit about this, whether the risk is real, and then possible consequences or strategies we could use to deal with this? Thanks.
I wish I could, to be honest, because I don't know what the facts are. I mean, in the old days of the Cold War, I used to actually study things like strategic minerals, and there were minerals, with names that were beyond my capacity to pronounce. But I think the general rule is this: if it is truly a strategic mineral, and the Chinese do have the lock on the market, whatever that means, either because it's, it exists inside mainland China, or they simply refuse to bring it to market, then you have to find either you build up a national reserves of some kind of your own, or you invest in innovation that economizes on the use of that component, of that mineral or metal or whatever it is. But I think you have to do this strictly by using the laws of economics. So if there is truly a lock, and again, this is a factual question to which I don't know the answer, then you have to find workarounds. Because you don't want to be in a position where there is truly a natural resource that somebody else has which you have no access to. But, I remember from the old Soviet days, where very often a lot of this was exaggerated, where people got extremely excited that the Soviets got the last iota of vanadium, or whatever it was. And everyone got revved up, and we had to kind of figure out how to steal that last ounce before the Soviets got their hands on it. And as long as we are honest and being kind of reasonably sensible about it, there are some strategies that will require us to go out and buy our way out of the problem. There are other strategies that will require us to innovate. There are third strategies that will require us to build stockpiles. But, just be sensible about it. I mean, there's no magic solution to this issue. My own prejudice is that the truly strategic elements that are in short supply are very, very few. And the great thing about technology is that you can, with a little application of mind and resources, do find ways to at least economize on their use.
Carl Lundgren, Jonah Speaks. In the email for this talk, it said you would be talking about the likelihood of future war. And you had here three possibilities: between China and the US, between China and India, or between China and its neighbors. And do you want to comment on that?
Thank you. I'll have to bare my horns. My short answer to it is that war is not obsolete where China is concerned. And it's not obsolete not because the Chinese are looking for a war, but because their definition of national security is such that even territories that they currently do not control, aka Taiwan, represent casus belli for them. And that is a very difficult situation to find oneself in. It's one thing to say Tibet, a territory that they actually physically control, secedes. And that precipitates the use of force, understandable. But when you have threatened uses of force over territories that you have not exercised control since the beginning of the Chinese state in 1949, it becomes hard to declare war as obsolete. And particularly because their theory of national unification after the century of humiliation and all the historical elements has put them in a position where they are not willing to countenance peaceful separation. And increasingly now there are doubts whether de facto separation is something that they can live with. So my bottom line answer would be, where China is concerned, war is not obsolete. And by extension, because war is not obsolete in certain subsets of cases, the prospect of a conflict with the United States cannot be ruled out. And certainly the Chinese are operating on that assumption. I mean, everything that the Chinese have been doing since at least 1995 is done with two ends in view. One is to achieve the local tactical objective, whatever that objective may be. But the second is to make certain that Uncle Sam doesn't come in and spoil the party. And because China is doing this, there are second-order effects. And the second-order effects are that China's neighbors get very nervous. And so when you begin to start amassing a 1,000-plus SRBM force on the East Coast, and you begin to have large numbers of IRBMs and MRBMs coming online, the Japanese begin to lose a few winks of sleep. The Indians begin to get a little antsy. All kinds of strange things happen. So the bottom line is that got to prepare for it. It's not gone away. I'm sorry, but peace hasn't broken out yet.
Given our time constraints, we have one final question.
Thank you. My name is Stephanie Young. I'm from Booz Allen Hamilton. My question to you is, given that it is in the best interest of both the U.S., our strategic partners, our friends, to keep globalization going and to enable interdependence, how can we better motivate and empower our allies and our friends to assist us in that effort? Because clearly we can't afford to keep paying for all the public goods.
It's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard, because one of the things that allowed us to get over the problem historically, well, there were two things that allowed us to get over the problems historically. The first was there was a common threat that everyone felt more or less uniformly. I mean, that was a great thing about the Soviet Union. They just scared the living daylights out of all our partners. And that motivated the partners to essentially become part of the enterprise. The second was that we were a lot richer then than we are now. And we were a lot richer because we came out of the war much better than many other people did. It's very hard to reproduce these two conditions today. With the first, if you take a poll of Western leaders and ask them what they think about China, there are some who have views that approximate those of the US, which is, don't know where they're going, could be a competitor, need to be prepared. But for the large number of our European allies, they just don't care. China is very far away. So there's a strategic issue with respect to how you perceive China and the challenges that that imposes. There's a second set of issues. Many of our allies see their economic interests as being competitive with US economic interests for the Chinese market. And so the kind of things that we may want to do over time with respect to managing China, like for example, a renewed COCOM, is going to be extremely hard to implement. In the Cold War, we had a clear understanding of what the problem was, and we had a unified worldview that we're going to protect certain technologies, not going to let them go past the gate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Today, it's extremely hard to figure out how you would protect key technologies. One, when there are multiple centers of power, when people actually stand to gain from a restrictive regime. Think about it. If you set up a regime that says no American companies can sell X gizmo to the Chinese, there are scores of Europeans, Israelis, many of our friends, many of our enemies, who have the capacity to sell some facsimile of that gizmo. They're happy to sell. In fact, they want the US to bind its own companies. So it's going to be a hard challenge. And my view is there will never be a satisfactory solution until we get to that moment of strategic clarity that I talked about. And unfortunately, you can't force that strategic clarity. That will come only with time. Because over a period of time, if China succeeds, it will become more confident and it will become more assertive. And if it does follow that path, which I believe it will, then it will concentrate the mind and people will begin to revisit their choices. But as long as we are in this between the times environment, it is going to be extremely hard to get our allies to be singing off the same page. So we're going to have one set of challenges managing the Chinese, but we're going to have another set of challenges managing our friends.
Please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you. Thank you.